Earth was refused a seat at the council, so humanity claimed the entire chamber. The doors were already closing when I walked out. Not slowly. Not with ceremony. They shut the way a verdict shuts, fast, final, and without any interest in what you have to say afterward. I heard the locking mechanism click behind me. A sound like a period at the end of a sentence that you were never allowed to finish. My name is Yara Osei. I was Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Sovereignty Council. I say was, not because I resigned, but because the word ambassador implies a relationship between two parties who have agreed to speak. After that day, only one of us had agreed to anything. The corridor outside the Chamber of Accord was long and pale, lit by soft panels of bioluminescent stone that the Velhari architects had installed 3,000 years before humans had figured out how to make glass. It was beautiful. The kind of beautiful that is designed to make you feel small. I walked through it with my chin level and my hands loose at my sides, and I did not look back. Behind me, through walls thick enough to muffle a supernova, the council was already moving on. Archon Civil had dissolved my petition with a gesture, a single light flick from his upper manipulator limb, and the session log would record it as a routine denial. Provisional emergent species. That was what they called us. The phrase was not cruel. That was what made it worse. It was bureaucratic. Clinical. It had the tone of someone explaining to a child why they could not sit at the adult table, not out of malice, but out of a deep and unquestioned certainty that the child simply was not ready. I had prepared for this. I had read every denial on record going back 400 years. I had studied the language of the refusal, the framing, the procedural steps. I had prepared myself intellectually for the outcome. What I had not prepared for was the silence of the gallery when it happened. 312 delegations, representing species from across the galaxy, and not one of them made a sound. Some of them had been watching me since I arrived. I had caught a few of their expressions during the session, not hostility, not sympathy, just a quiet, practiced detachment. The kind that comes from watching this happen many times. That was the part that stayed with me in the corridor. Not the denial. The silence. My aide, a young man named Callum Ward who had joined the mission fresh out of the diplomatic corps and still had the habit of standing too straight when he was nervous, fell into step beside me without a word. He was 26. He had packed 3 years of study into 18 months to qualify for this posting. He had memorized the council's procedural charter in 4 languages, including one that had no phonetic equivalent in any human tongue. He had done all of that to stand in that gallery and watch a light flick dissolve everything. He did not say anything. I was grateful for that. We reached the transit bay, passed through the decontamination arch, and boarded our shuttle without speaking to anyone. The council's custodial staff, tall, gray-scaled beings called the Yenu, who handled logistics for visiting delegations, closed the shuttle hatch with the same efficient courtesy they extended to everyone. No different treatment. No acknowledgement that something had just happened. To them, it probably had not. They had seen hundreds of species come through that corridor. The shuttle lifted from the dock and angled out through the Vethan Prime atmospheric shield. Below us, the capital city spread in concentric rings of light, an 11,000-year-old civilization wearing its age-like polished armor. From up here, it looked permanent. Like something that had always existed and always would. I pulled up the secure channel to Geneva. Secretary General Pyotr Novak appeared on the screen. He was a careful man, not cold, but careful. He had been a lawyer before he was a diplomat, and before that a labor negotiator, and you could see all 3 of those things in the way he held his face when he was waiting for news he already suspected was bad. I told him in 4 sentences. Denial. Provisional emergent species classification. No floor time given. Petition dissolved without discussion. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you all right?" It was the question I had not expected, and because of that, it almost undid me. I steadied myself and said yes. And then I said the thing I had been turning over in my mind since the corridor, since the click of the lock, since the silence of the gallery. They didn't say no to me. They said no to 8 billion people who have never stopped fighting for a seat at every table that tried to exclude them. Every union hall, every council chamber, every courtroom, every moment in our history where someone was told they did not qualify, we kept going. We always kept going. So that is what we are going to do. We are not going to petition again. We are going to make the petition irrelevant. Pyotr looked at me for a long time through the screen. Callum was watching from his seat across the cabin, trying to look like he was not listening. What does that mean, practically? Pyotr asked. It means we stop asking for a seat, I said. And we start building a table that everyone who has ever refused a seat at this one will want to sit at instead. When enough of them sit there, the council either joins us or becomes a historical footnote. Another silence. Then Pyotr said, "How long?" 5 years, I said. Maybe less if we're focused. Maybe more if we're cautious. But it starts tonight. I need a ship, a small team, and authorization to operate outside standard diplomatic protocol. No press. No announcements. Just work. He looked at me the way people look at someone who has just said something that is either brilliant or ruinous and they cannot yet tell which. You have it, he said. I closed the channel and looked out the shuttle window. Vethin Prime was shrinking behind us, its rings of light growing smaller, the chamber of Accord somewhere in the middle of it all, moving on to its next session, already having forgotten the moment that had just changed everything. Callum cleared his throat. Ambassador, where are we going? I thought about the list I had been building for 3 years. Species after species, quietly catalogued, noted for grievances and untapped potential and positions in the council that gave them votes without giving them voice. I thought about the Durek with their stripped seats and their engineering minds. I thought about the Oresi Collective, slow and brilliant and completely unrepresented by a charter that did not consider Silicon life fully sovereign. I thought about 40 other species like them, scattered across the fringe of council space, technically members, functionally furniture. Everywhere they told us not to go, I said. Callum nodded once, sharp and certain, and pulled up the navigation system without another word. The shuttle punched into faster travel, and Vethin Prime disappeared, and the work began. I want to be clear about something. What happened over the next 5 years was not a rebellion. It was not a war. It was not even, in the traditional sense, a confrontation. What it was conversation, the most deliberate, relentless, and carefully structured campaign of conversation in human diplomatic history. We started with the Durek. Their homeworld, Dural, sits at the edge of what the council calls the peripheral reach, a stretch of space that sounds romantic and is anything but. The planets out there are older, colder, and less resource-rich than the systems closer to council center. The species that live there are not less intelligent or less capable. They are simply less convenient. The council's inner circle had learned long ago that inconvenient species make the easiest targets for procedural punishment. The Durek had been punished twice. Their first seat had been stripped 40 years ago over a border dispute that, when I read the full record, was clearly manufactured by a Velhari-aligned trade coalition to protect their shipping monopoly in that sector. The second stripping came 80 years before that, for a vote that the Durek cast against a council resolution that would have legalized a form of labor contract the Durek considered involuntary servitude. They had been right to vote against it. They had been punished for it anyway. When my ship, the ESV Meridian, docked at Dural's orbital platform, the welcome was polite and nothing more. The Durek are a beetle-shaped species, compact, precise, with compound eyes that catch light in ways that can be unsettling until you get used to them, and they do not waste warmth on strangers. Their elder diplomat, a being named Kethal, met us in a reception chamber that was functional and cold and smelled faintly of mineral processing. There was no ceremony. There was no food offered. There was a table, 2 chairs sized for humans and 2 for Durek, and a straight-backed sense that this meeting had better be worth the docking clearance. I sat down and opened with the thing I had decided to open with on the entire journey here, honesty. My species was refused a seat at the council 6 weeks ago, I said. I am not here to ask you for help getting one. I am here because your species was refused the same thing twice, and I think you have been waiting a long time for someone to say out loud that those refusals were wrong. Kethal's compound I shifted. One of the features of Durek biology that took humans a long time to read correctly is that their primary emotional signal is not facial expression, it is the angle of their head. A slight tilt back means skepticism. A tilt forward means interest. Kethal tilted forward by roughly 4 degrees. For a Durek, that was practically leaning in. You have read our record, he said. His translator rendered his voice as low and even, though I had been told by the xenolinguistics team that the original frequencies carried something sharper. Every document the council made public and several they did not, I said. And what do you want from reading it? Nothing yet, I said. I want to tell you what I am planning to do, and I want to know if you think it is worth doing. Not whether you will help. Not whether you will join us. Just whether you think it is worth doing. That seemed to surprise him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, most species come here wanting something. We will probably want something eventually, I said. But right now I am asking for your opinion. You have been navigating this council for longer than my civilization has had electricity. Your judgment on what is possible inside that system is more valuable to me right now than any trade offer I could make. Callum, sitting beside me, was completely still. He had learned to do that, to become almost invisible when I was in a moment that needed space. Kethal looked at me for a long time. Then he said, everyone else wanted allies. They offered us things. Ships, minerals, technology sharing agreements. They wanted us to be useful. You are the first one to ask us what we think. I mean it, I said. I know, he said. That is the part one I'm not sure how to process. We talked for 6 hours that first day. He told me things about the council's inner workings that I had not been able to find in any record, procedural tricks the Velhari bloc used to delay votes until fringe delegations were forced to return to their home systems, leaving them absent for the count. Quorum rules that were technically neutral but practically guaranteed to suppress dissent. The way the chamber's seating arrangement placed the highest influence species closest to the speaking floor, which had begun as tradition and had quietly become structural advantage. I took notes on all of it. Not because I did not already know some of it, but because it mattered that he was the one telling me. It mattered that he knew I was listening. On the third day, Kethal said something that I have thought about many times since. You want allies, he said. Everyone does. But you are offering something different. You are offering to owe us something. Yes, I said. Most species avoid that. We are not most species, I said. He tilted his head forward again. More than 4 degrees this time. We did not sign any formal agreement that visit. We did not need to. What we left Dural with was harder to counterfeit than a signed document. It was trust that had been earned one honest sentence at a time, in a cold reception room at the edge of council space, by 2 species that had both been told they did not qualify. From Dural, we went to the Oresi Collective. The Oresi are silicon-based, which means they do not experience time the way carbon-based life does. A conversation with an Oresi that feels like 30 minutes to a human might span what the Oresi experiences as several weeks of internal processing. This had led most council species to treat them as slow, which was not only wrong but exactly backwards. The Oresi were processing more information in that 30 minutes than most species could manage in a month. They were not slow. The rest of the galaxy was simply very loud and very impatient. Their representative, a being whose closest name approximation in English was something like Ven, met us in a chamber that was almost entirely dark, lit only by the soft luminescence of Ven's own body. It was like sitting across from a thinking constellation. I had prepared a document before we arrived. Not a speech, not a proposal, a charter draft. 12 pages. It had one feature that I placed at the front and told Ven to read first. It read, all cognitive architectures shall be recognized as legally equivalent under this framework, regardless of substrate, composition, or processing speed. Ven was still for a long time after reading it. Long even by Oresi standards. Then Ven said, in a voice that came through the translator as something between a chord and a question, you have written this before knowing if it benefits you. It does benefit us, I said. We are a species that has spent a great deal of our history deciding which kinds of minds count. We got that wrong repeatedly. We would like to not get it wrong again. The council charter does not include this language, Ven said. No, I said. That is why we are not building on the council charter. Another long silence. Then, what are you building? An alternative, I said. Not a replacement yet. Just an alternative. A place where the species the council forgot to treat fairly can have a voice that actually works. Ven's luminescence shifted in a way that my xenobiology briefing notes described as the Oresi equivalent of taking a breath before speaking something important. We have been a member of the council for 600 years, Ven said. In that time we have cast votes on 412 resolutions. Of those, we were on the deciding side 11 times. The other 401 were decided before we were consulted. I know, I said. Then you understand why this document makes us afraid, Ven said. Hope after a long disappointment is frightening, I said. I know that too. We stayed with the Oresi Collective for 9 days. When we left, Ven had not signed anything. But Ven had agreed to continue the conversation, and with the Oresi, continuing the conversation was the closest thing to a yes that existed. Over the next 2 years, we visited 41 more species. Some welcomed us with open curiosity. Some were guarded. 2 refused to meet at all, and I respected that and moved on. In every meeting, I followed the same approach: listen first, speak second, offer honestly, never promise what I could not deliver, and never pretend that what we were doing was easy or guaranteed. The council noticed. About 14 months into the Meridian's tour, a council operative named something the translator rendered as Vassal Own came to us at a refueling station in the Bren system. He was Velhari, tall and precise, dressed in the pale blue of council diplomatic staff, and he made a point of waiting until Callum had stepped away before he approached me. He offered Earth a provisional observer status, a non-voting, monitored seat at council sessions, available on a case-by-case basis, subject to revocation at any time. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "That is very kind of the council to offer." "It is a significant gesture," he said. "It is a window seat," I said. "And we are past that." He studied me with the particular Velhari expression that their species uses when they are recalibrating an assumption. "You understand what you are risking," he said. "Continued exclusion. Trade complications. The council has long reach. So does Earth," I said. "We just rarely use it in the direction anyone expects." He left without another word. I watched his shuttle undock from the station and thought about what his visit meant. They were paying attention. They were not yet worried, not truly, but they were paying attention. That was enough for now. Callum came back with 2 cups of station-brewed coffee, handed me one, and said, "Did that go the way I think it went?" "Yes," I said. "Good," he said, and sipped his coffee, and asked nothing else. The Meridian continued its tour. The conversations continued. The trust continued to build, one meeting at a time, one honest exchange at a time, in cold reception rooms and dim Oresi chambers and docking bays and orbital platforms at the edge of council space. I kept a running list of the species who had moved from skeptical to interested, from interested to committed, from committed to actively planning. When the list crossed 30, I stopped counting and started writing the legal challenge. The council had a statute on its books, the Accord of Fundamental Restructure. It was 4,000 years old. It had never been invoked. It allowed any 30-member species to call for a full constitutional review of council governance if they could demonstrate systemic procedural harm. I was going to invoke it. But first, I needed a crisis to prove the harm was real. As it turned out, the council gave me one without being asked. The first report came in on a Tuesday morning, ship time, while the Meridian was in transit between the Oresi habitat ring and a small world called Bretis, home to a fishbone species called the Lurith who had been quietly losing coastal territory to a Velhari-backed mining operation for 30 years. The report was flagged urgent by the monitoring system. I read it before I was fully awake. 3 worlds were sick. 2 of them were Durak colonies, the outer settlements of Dural, home to about 400,000 beings. The third was the Oresi habitat ring where we had spent 9 days talking with Ven. The illness was fast-moving, unlike anything in the standard xenopathogen database, and it was spreading through shared atmospheric systems in a way that made natural origin almost impossible. The word engineered was in the report, flagged as preliminary, flagged as unconfirmed. But I had read enough intelligence briefings to know what preliminary and unconfirmed meant in this context. It meant someone knew, and the someone was not ready to say so officially. I had Callum plot an immediate course change to the nearest Durak colony while I pulled up the council's emergency channel. The council had already been notified. A session had been called. I watched the live feed on my screen while the Meridian changed heading and pushed its drive as hard as our engineer, a steady woman named Helen Doyle, was willing to push it. What I watched over the next 14 days was the council at its most honest, not in what it said, but in what it failed to do. The session opened with statements. Every major bloc made one. They were compassionate in language and empty in content. Offers to study the situation. Offers to convene a secondary panel. Offers to establish a review committee that would report back within 90 days. 90 days. People were dying in real time and the council was scheduling meetings. The Velhari bloc moved 3 times to delay the aid vote pending confirmation of origin. The first delay passed with support from 2 allied blocs who depended on Velhari trade routes. The second delay was tighter, 17 votes. The third barely held. On day 14, the council adjourned without authorizing a single ship, a single supply line, or a single medical team. I had watched it all from the bridge of the Meridian, which by day 4 was already in orbit above the first Durak colony. Let me be precise about this. We had no legal authorization to be there. The Durek colony was sovereign space. We had no treaty granting us access. We had no council sanction. What we had was a medical bay, a crew of 29 people, 3 years of goodwill built visit by visit, and a doctor named Oliver Marsh who had not slept in 40 hours and had not once suggested that we leave. Oliver was 34 years old. He had trained as a xenopathogen specialist, which is exactly as difficult as it sounds. It requires understanding diseases across biological systems that share almost nothing in common. He was quiet in the way that intensely focused people are quiet, not reserved, just elsewhere, deep in the problem while the rest of the world conducted its business around him. He had dark circles under his eyes that had been there since the first morning, and he worked with the kind of steady certainty that made everyone around him work better. He developed a treatment protocol within 72 hours. Not a cure, the pathogen was too complex for that yet, but a suppression method that bought time. That was what the colonies needed. Time. I broadcast on every council frequency available, open channel, diplomatic band, public record. I did not shout. I did not make demands. I stated the facts with the same precision I would use in a courtroom. The Earthship Meridian is currently providing emergency medical assistance to the Durek colony at these coordinates. We are not a council member. We are not operating under any treaty authorization. We are operating under the only principle that does not require a committee to approve it, the principle that people who are suffering and people who can help them should not be separated by paperwork. We are here because we have ships and we have a doctor and we were already close. We will stay until we are no longer needed. The response from the council was a formal notice of potential sanctions for unauthorized entry into sovereign space. I filed it and kept working. On day 6, a Durek engineering team came to the Meridian's bay door and asked if they could help. They had seen how the suppression treatment was being delivered and had an idea for improving the dispersal mechanism. Oliver took one look at their design and said yes immediately. They worked side by side for 11 hours straight. The improved dispersal system cut treatment time by 60%. On day 18, we lost Oliver. He had gone down to the surface to work directly with the most severe cases. The pathogen had mutated slightly in one subcolony, producing a variant that his suit filtration was not calibrated for. He was exposed. The colony's medical team worked on him for 8 hours. He did not make it. I sat in the Meridian's small common room when they told me and did not say anything for a long time. Callum sat across from me. Helen sat beside him. Nobody tried to make it better. That is the thing about people who have worked together long enough, they know that some things cannot be made better, only survived. I went to my console and added Oliver Marsh to the mission log. Not as a casualty. As crew, with full honors, and the notation that he had given 34 years of his life to understanding how very different forms of life could be kept alive, and had spent the last 4 of those years making sure that knowledge crossed species lines. The next day, Ket Hall sent a transmission. He did not speak in his usual measured diplomatic cadence. He spoke slowly, with deliberate pauses, and the translator worked hard to carry the weight of what he was saying. He told me that the Durek had a mourning rite, one that was performed only for those who died in the act of protecting a Durek life. It had existed for 2,000 years. It had never, in the entire recorded history of the practice, been performed for a non-Durek. They were going to perform it for Oliver. He said the name of the rite in his own language, and I did not ask for a translation. Some things should not be translated. Some things should just be heard as they are, in the voice that means them. When the transmission ended, Callum looked at me, and I looked at him, and neither of us spoke. There was nothing to add. The mortality rate across all 3 affected worlds dropped to 18% by day 25, down from over 70. It was not a perfect outcome. 412 people died before treatment reached them. But 412 became the number, not 4,000 or 40,000, because a ship that had no business being there was already in the neighborhood. The council responded to our intervention the way institutions respond to being outpaced by individuals, with paperwork. A formal censure motion was filed against Earth, unauthorized action in sovereign space, interference with council jurisdictional procedures, failure to seek sanction before deployment. The motion was presented to the full chamber. It required a simple majority to pass. 14 species voted against it. That was not a majority defeat, the censure passed, but those 14 votes were the story. They came from fringe species, most of them parties to conversations the Meridian had carried out over the previous 3 years. They voted as a bloc, together, for the first time in 3 centuries. The council's inner circle noticed. Even a defeated minority vote can announce the shape of what is coming. I filed a formal response to the censure. It was 12 pages long. It included, in the appendix, a careful accounting of the 14 days the council had debated while people died, alongside the 40 days it took an unauthorized ship to reduce mortality by 80%. I sent a copy to every delegation in the chamber. Then I sent for our legal team, a trio of international law specialists based in Cape Town, and told them to begin drafting the invocation of the Accord of Fundamental Restructure. I needed 30 co-signatories. I was already certain I had more than that. What I needed now was the right moment, and the right evidence. Fortunately, the pathogen's origin analysis came back 3 weeks later. It was engineered. The signature matched a biotech subsidiary operating out of a Velhari industrial system. The subsidiary had a council licensing registration. The licensing registration had been approved by a committee that included 2 members of the Velhari's inner diplomatic bloc. I read the report 3 times. Not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain that what I was reading was what I thought it was. It was. I called Pyotr Novak. He looked at the report for a long time without speaking. "This changes things," he said. "It confirms things," I said. "There is a difference. I already knew the council was broken. Now I can prove it in a language it cannot procedurally dismiss." "Are you ready?" he asked. I thought about Oliver. I thought about Kethall's morning rite. I thought about Ven's luminescence shifting in the dark. I thought about 34 species who had sat with me in cold rooms and uncertain hope and trusted that this was worth doing. "We have been ready," I said. "I have just been waiting for them to hand me the proof." The Chamber of Accord had seen many things in 11,000 years. It had seen empires negotiated out of existence. It had seen species admitted to galactic civilization who had never before seen a star from outside their own atmosphere. It had seen more narrowly averted by arguments made in this exact room, by voices that spoke for millions of beings who would never know how close things had come. It was a room that had weight to it, not metaphorically, but almost physically. The air inside felt older than the air outside. The chamber's stone floor had been polished by the footsteps of delegates for so many centuries that it had a faint glow, as if the history underfoot was still radiating. I had stood in this room once before, as a petitioner, and been escorted out through closing doors. I was standing in it again now. But the posture was different. The paperwork was different. And the 34 beings standing behind me were very, very different from the empty gallery that had watched my petition dissolved without a word. Kethall stood at my left shoulder. He had made the journey from Dural personally, despite his age, despite the political risk. When I had told him he did not need to come, that a proxy vote would count equally, he had looked at me with that slight 4-degree forward tilt and said, "After what your doctor did for my people, do you think I would send a proxy?" Ven stood at my right, a column of soft shifting light in the chamber's pale illumination, drawing glances from delegations who had never seen an Oresi in person. 32 other delegations stood in a formation behind us, not theatrical, just present. They were there. They had shown up. That already said more than any speech I could write. Archon Civil sat at the head of the chamber's inner circle, in the elevated position that the council's seating arrangement had given the 5 most powerful species since the chamber was built. He was watching me with an expression I had not seen on a Velhari face before. Not anger. Not contempt. Something more careful than either. He was reassessing. He had filed me as a minor irritant 3 years ago and he was only now understanding what he had missed. I presented the invocation. The Accord of Fundamental Restructure was 4,000 years old. The Council's own legal scholars had studied it periodically over the centuries as an academic curiosity, an emergency clause written by the founders of the Council who had been paranoid enough to include a mechanism for their own system to be challenged from within. 4,000 years, and nobody had ever used it. Not because it was invalid. Because no coalition had ever been patient enough to build the numbers needed to invoke it. 30 co-signatories, the statute required. We presented 34. The Council's chief legal officer, a being named Erifdun whose species had served in that role for 600 years and whose expression was usually as unreadable as stone, took the document and read it in full, in the open chamber, without speaking. The room was completely silent. Even the ambient translation system seemed to hold their breath. When Erifdun finished, she said, in the flat, technical voice that her role required, "The invocation is formally valid under Section 14 of the Accord of Fundamental Restructure. The constitutional review process is hereby initiated." Council operations will proceed under interim protocols pending the review tribunal's findings. Suval's upper limbs moved, a small gesture, a controlled one, the Velhari version of someone pressing their palms to a table to steady themselves. I spoke then for the first time since entering the chamber. I want to be clear about what we are asking for, I said. We are not asking for the council to end. We are not asking for any species to lose its place in galactic governance. We are asking for a process that was promised to every species that signed the original Charter of Accord 11,000 years ago, a process that guarantees representation proportional to population and contribution, that guarantees voting rights that cannot be stripped for political convenience, and that guarantees equal legal standing for all recognized cognitive life regardless of substrate or biology. I paused. We are asking for the council to honor the document it was founded on. Nothing more. Nothing less. The hearing took 3 weeks. Every day, I sat before the tribunal, 3 arbiters drawn from species that held no seats and had no alignment with any bloc, a requirement I had insisted on and, to the council's credit, had been granted, and I presented evidence. The Durek seat strippings, documented and cross-referenced against the trade records that showed the Velhari-aligned shipping coalition's growth in the same period. The Oresi voting record, 412 resolutions, 11 deciding votes in 600 years. The mathematical distribution of effective voting power, built by Callum and 3 data analysts working out of the Meridian's research bay over 2 years, the chart showed, with devastating clarity, that 62% of the galaxy's recognized species controlled less than 11% of real policymaking power. The pathogen evidence came last. I presented it quietly, without drama, because it did not need drama. The facts were dramatic enough on their own. The Velhari's legal team was formidable. Their lead advocate, a sharp and experienced diplomat named Ren Hothus, argued for 3 full days. Her core argument was stability. The council's structure had maintained galactic peace for 11,000 years, and restructuring it based on the grievances of fringe species risked destabilizing arrangements that protected far more life than they disadvantaged. It was a real argument. I did not dismiss it. When my turn came to respond, I acknowledged it directly. The council kept the peace, I said. That is true. It is an achievement worth acknowledging, and we acknowledge it. But keeping the peace and distributing power fairly are not the same achievement. A structure that achieves one while systematically failing at the other is not a success. It is a structural debt, and debts accumulate. The council's inner circle has been borrowing against the patience of 62% of its members for 4,000 years. The bill is now being presented. We are not here to damage what the council built. We are here to pay what it owes. Suval spoke in the final session of the hearing. He had the right, as a head delegate, to address the tribunal directly. He spoke for 40 minutes. He talked about history, about the weight of 11,000 years of peace, about the complexity of governing hundreds of species with competing needs and limited resources. He was not wrong about any of it. His analysis was accurate and his delivery was compelling, and I sat across from him and listened to every word. And then I thought about Oliver Marsh, who had died at 34 years old in a subcolony of a species that was not his own, for a disease that should never have existed, while a chamber full of ancient power had debated scheduling. And I thought about the precise thing I had been saving for exactly this moment. When Suval finished, the tribunal asked if I had a response. I said, 1 sentence. The chamber went quiet. You kept the peace, I said. You also kept the power. Those are not the same achievement, and it is time the galaxy learned to tell them apart. Ren Hothus, across the room, looked at the table in front of her. Kethal, behind me, did not move. But I could feel him there, 4 degrees forward. The tribunal took 11 days to deliberate. I want to tell you what the decision said, but first I want to tell you where I was when I heard it. I was on the Meridian. Docked at the Vethan Prime Orbital Station, the same station I had left from 3 years ago after the petition was dissolved, the same sound of the lock clicking behind me. I had come back here deliberately. I wanted to hear the verdict in the same place where the journey had begun. It seemed right. Callum was beside me, standing in the same two-straight posture that he had carried out of the Chamber of Accord the first time and that had softened somewhat over 3 years of refueling stations and cold reception rooms and a doctor who taught him to calibrate his hope in measured, patient amounts. Helen Doyle was at the door, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed, the way she stood when she was waiting for something she had already decided she was ready for. The tribunal's decision came through on the official council channel, read by Aerith Dunn in her flat, technical voice, and it was 7 pages long, but I will give you the parts that mattered. The current voting structure of the Galactic Sovereignty Council was found to be procedurally inconsistent with the principles established in the founding charter of Accord. The stripping of the Durac seats was ruled a documented violation of procedural equity. The systematic underrepresentation of silicon-based cognitive life was ruled inconsistent with the legal definitions of sovereignty that the Council itself had ratified. The Inner Circle's veto power was suspended pending the design of a reformed governance framework. All 5 founding bloc species retained their seats, nobody was removed, but their unilateral control over agenda and vote timing was gone. 47 species received upgraded representation. The weighting formula was recalculated. The 62% would now hold 38% of real power, not perfect parity, but a shift large enough to make the next vote genuinely uncertain, and uncertain votes are the only kind that mean anything. A new category of membership was created, the contributory observer seat. Full voting rights on humanitarian, medical, and scientific matters. Non-binding input on territorial and political questions, with that standing to be reviewed in 10 years. The first one was offered to Earth. I read the whole document twice. Then I looked up at Callum and Helen. Helen said, "Well." Callum said, "We did it." I said, "Oliver did it. We just carried it the rest of the way." Nobody argued with that. The response from the Council's inner circle was swift and, I will be honest, expected. 2 member species announced trade restrictions on human shipping corridors within 48 hours. Ren Hothus made a public statement calling the tribunal's decision premature and politically motivated. Suvil said nothing publicly, which I found more interesting than anything he could have said. The restrictions were a problem, but a manageable one. We had 34 friends with ports and trade relationships that had been built on something more durable than convenience. When I contacted Kethal about rerouting options, he had already begun drafting an alternative logistics chain before I finished the sentence. "We anticipated this," he said. "I know," I said. "Thank you." "You do not need to thank us," he said. "You owe us. That is different. Remember." I laughed. Genuinely, out loud, for the first time in what felt like a long time. Kethal made a sound that his translator rendered as a low, satisfied chord. I chose to believe it was his version of laughing too. 3 weeks later, the Chamber of Accord opened its first session under the interim reformed structure. The seating had been changed, a requirement of the tribunal's decision. The old arrangement, with the 5 inner circle species elevated and centered and the fringe delegations arranged in concentric rings of diminishing proximity to the speaking floor, was gone. The new arrangement was circular. Every delegation at equal distance from the center. No elevation. No hierarchy of position. The speaking floor was accessible from any direction. I walked into the Chamber of Accord for the 3rd time in 5 years. The first time, I had walked out through closing doors. The second time, I had walked in to file a challenge that 11,000 years of institutional history had never seen. The third time, I walked to a seat. Not the nearest available seat, not the most strategically visible seat. Just a seat, one of 361, arranged in a circle, equidistant from the floor, no different from any other. I sat down. I did not look for Suvil immediately. When I did find him across the chamber, he was looking at the new seating chart with an expression that I could not fully read. Not defeat, exactly. Not acceptance. Something in between, the look of someone who has lived inside a structure their entire life and is seeing its walls rearranged for the first time and is not yet sure whether the new shape is better or simply different. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked away. I did not need him to concede. I did not need him to apologize. I did not need anything from him anymore. That was perhaps the strangest and quietest victory of the whole thing, not the tribunal decision, not the seat, not the reformed chamber, but the moment I realized I was sitting in the room where I had once been escorted out, and I felt nothing toward the people who had escorted me except a mild and genuine indifference. The first vote of the reformed session was called to order by the new presiding moderator, a rotating role, chosen by lottery from the full membership, which meant it was now genuinely possible for any species in the chamber to guide a session. The vote was on the Universal Galactic Aid Protocol. A binding resolution that would require the Council to authorize emergency humanitarian response within 72 hours of a confirmed crisis, regardless of jurisdictional complexity, and would pre-allocate resources from a joint fund to which all members contributed proportionally. It was the vote that the old Council had failed to take when the Durac colonies were sick and Oliver Marsh was still alive. The vote passed at 312 to 14. Every fringe species voted yes. A significant number of inner circle delegations voted yes. The 14 nays came from the species that had also filed the trade restrictions. I cast Earth's vote. I did not make a speech about it. I did not raise my voice or my hand in any dramatic gesture. I simply registered the vote through the chamber's system, the way every other delegate had, and watched the tally update on the chamber's central display. Then I sat back in my seat in the circular chamber where once there had been no room for us, in the room where the doors had once closed on the sound of a verdict, and I thought about Oliver Marsh. I thought about the way he had worked, quietly, steadily, completely absorbed in the problem in front of him, not the problem of species relations or political strategy or the weight of what it might mean, just the problem of people who were sick and needed help. He had not been there for the philosophy of it. He had been there because it was the right thing and he knew how to do it and he had ships. I thought about Kethal's morning rite, said in words I never had translated, meant for a man who would never hear it. I thought about Venn in the dark, luminescence shifting, reading a sentence that no charter had ever bothered to include before. I thought about Callum at 26, packing 3 years of study into 18 months, and at 31, standing in the orbital station with that look on his face that was not triumph exactly but something quieter and more durable than triumph. I thought about 8 billion people on a planet that had never stopped trying. Every courtroom, every council chamber, every union hall, every moment in our long and complicated history where someone had been told the door was closed and had looked for another way in. We were not always right. We were not always kind. But we did not stop. We kept pushing, kept building, kept finding the statute that nobody had ever read closely enough and the coalition that nobody had thought to assemble and the doctor who was willing to go to the surface. The Chamber of Accord continued its session. New votes were called. New business was raised. The moderator moved through the agenda with the particular rhythm of an institution that is figuring out, in real time, what it sounds like when more voices are allowed to speak. I sat in my seat in the circle and listened. Somewhere in a Duric colony, people were alive who should not have been. Somewhere in an Oresi habitat ring, a thinking constellation was processing what it meant to have a charter that included your name in the language of equals for the first time in 600 years. Somewhere in Cape Town, a legal team was probably celebrating in a way that involved considerably more noise than I was comfortable with, and I was glad for them. And somewhere, not anywhere I could point to, not anywhere on any map, a quiet, focused man who had not slept enough and had spent his life learning how very different kinds of life could be kept alive was owed a debt that no vote and no resolution and no reformed council could ever fully repay. I cast his vote too. That was enough. That was everything.